Let's give everyone a minute and then we'll crack on. Thank you for everyone for joining me. That's wonderful. Very excited. Just a little bit of what's the word? Housekeeping. I will be taking questions afterwards if anyone wants to ask any questions, so you can have your brain boxes going while I'm talking. I have a bit of a sniffle and I really apologize for that. My son brought home a cold the other day, so if I am a bit sniffly, again, I apologize. And if everyone can just stay on mute while the talk's going on. As I said, afterwards I'll take some questions and we'll go from there. So I guess time to crack on. So thank you very much to everyone for joining me. Today I'm talking about giants, and I put "and other strange peoples of the Isle of Wight." And I mean strange in the nicest possible way. So they're all going to be large peoples, large creatures, all in the themes of giants. So how is this all going to work? So the first thing I want to say is, like I always do with these talks, nothing is made up. It's just remembered differently. And as a storyteller, I'm not going to tell you what is and what isn't. I'll let you decide. This is not an academic talk. This is a storytelling talk, and it's to tell the stories of oral traditions that are fast disappearing on the island. So some of these are based on other people. So I will be sharing someone else's story, a guy called Abraham Elder, which we'll talk about when we get to him. And the others are stories that have been shared with me over the years. So what we'll be talking about. So first, names, places, stories. I'll take you through a map. We'll talk about the places where these things happened and where these stories come from. We'll talk about what are giants. And then the 4 stories that we're going to be having today. We have the Tréowmann, the Giant of Chael, Geat or Gautr. Gautr is the old English name for Geat. Orri. And then after that, as I said, we'll take questions. So here's the map of my little magical map of the island. And this is where our stories will take place today. So I think I've got a way of drawing on here. So I'm going to draw a little thing. So let's try this. Right. So we're going to start here in Brading. And Brading was known for many different things to do with giants and that side of sorts of things. And then we're going to move down, and we're going to go to sort of the south of the island. We're going to talk about Black Gangchine and the giants from there. And then we'll be moving to the center of the island, and what's now called Motterston, which its name derives from Multastan, the talking stone. And then lastly, we'll end up here on the far west of the island, the Needles, where we'll talk about Orri. So that's our journey today. Oops, hang on, let me change this back to mouse. There we go. Right. So very quickly, I need to keep an eye on the time because I've only got 10 minutes for each main section. Excuse me. So what are giants? So first of all, we're going to talk about the Old English or the Anglo-Saxon or the Utis or the Jutes. The Isle of Wight was settled by the Utis, which we call Jutes now. And the giants were kind of, I guess they were put into a type of creature, the Intres or the Thres, or the Gigants. So what does that mean? So I guess they're a combination of what we would now probably lump uh, fairies and ghosts and other magical beings, supernatural beings. They're all different types of those, and these words, although you can't tell it from here, are the roots of over the years of things like the bogeyman and things like that. They all sort of come from these roots. So where do giants come from? Well, on the Isle of Wight, the name the Isle of Wight comes from Witger, who was said to be Witger and stuff. Witger was said to be the first king of the island, or the Anglo-Saxon, and Witger comes from the basically mean the giant spear, and stuff was his brother, which was stump or club. And both giant spears and clubs are very much associated with giants. So there is this, I guess, link between those two. What they're not sluggish, they're not stupid things as they're portrayed now. Giants were creators, they were magical, and yes, they were at odds with humans, but they weren't slow, sluggish, and stupid as they are sometimes portrayed these days. Were they gods? So the Old English Isa or Eusta is analogous to the gods, and they weren't gods, but they were. When we're talking about the Anglo-Saxons, they were seen as peers of the gods, and in some cases, they were said that they were brothers of the gods. And are they what is pronounced Ilfe or elves? Now, when you think of elves these days, you think of tiny little creatures, but the Ilfe, which in the Isle of Wight tongue became Yelf, and the Yelf, that word actually is still used quite recently, and there are places on the island that reflect that word Yelf, but it was originally pronounced Ilfe. What we think of elves as tiny little creatures with little hats, not the same thing at all. And they all, in some ways, in some places, giants were thought of as parts of the same ilk as elves, creators and builders and so forth. And but where did they come from? What created the giants? So some say they were created from clay and mud. Some say that they were the sons of gods, and you can see that in biblical stories when they talk about the Nephilim, the sons of angels and men. And in some cases, those stories bleed over or are a memory of older stories of the gods who came and mingled with humanity, and these great giants were born. But they're probably not gods, but seen in the same sort of vein, I guess is the best way of saying it. So that's what they are and what they're not. But what I think everyone can agree on is what a giant is, and the giant is huge, massive. And that's the stories we're going to be talking about today. let's go on to our first story, the Tréowmann. Tréowmann is the old English or the old Utis for wooden man or tree man. And that's what this story is about. Now, the story starts in a place called Brading, which I mentioned earlier. And Brading is known for the stories of finding the remains of the giant folk, but also this story. And when Brading was very young, when it was just a small settlement, sitting on the banks of what is a great the sea, basically, they found themselves in a situation where they were struggling to survive against the encroaching sea that was coming in all the time. And a wanderer walked by, and he was called the Grim Millionaire, the hooded man or the masked man. And some say that the Grim Millionaire was an incarnation of Woden. And he took pity on these people. And so he created two great wooden men, the Tréowmann and his brother, the Thorgathor. And in the Thorgathor, to make him more human, he placed the heart of a person inside. And the Tréowmann he made. And all was well in the beginning. The Thorgathor felt empathy for these people. He felt love, and he did his best to help in every way he possibly could. The Tréowmann earnestly and happily and unquestionable just did what he was told, without understanding, but without wanting to understand. And we have this saying, and there's the saying, the old English, Volden, Wortharth, Wehel, Volda, Alvolda. And that means Volden wrought idols, the wondrous ruler. And over time, these wondrous creatures that he created, things started to change. The Thorgathro, because he wasn't human, their heart started to wither and rot. And as it started to rot inside him, it started to die. And he lost all compassion for humanity and only saw his own power. And as such, he started to resent these humans who were telling him what to do. And so he started to take it upon himself to see that he was the ruler, which of course the people did not like, and they forced him to leave. And they forced him to leave with threats of fire. And so he left, but he said he would be back and have his revenge. And the Tréowmann stayed because he was seen as good, and he did what he was told unquestioningly. And then many years later, Thorgathor did come back in the dead of night. He went through the town destroying houses and belongings. The town elders gathered together the strong men and the men at arms, and they fired arrows at the Thorgathor, arrows with lighted ends, and set him ablaze. The Thorgathor wailed and screamed and burnt and fell to the ground and was pushed into the sea. But this also signaled the end of the relationship between the Tréowmann and the people. because they were now scared of him. They didn't know that he stay the same. So they asked him to leave, and obediently he did. And off he left. And so the townspeople rebuilt. They felled many trees around them. They robbed the flood defenses that the Tréowmann and his brother had built to rebuild the houses and the church and the streets. And they were proud of what they built. But the Tréowmann, off in the distance, sat quietly and watched his people. And then one night, a storm hit. A great storm of lightning and fire, hail, sleet, and rain, and rain, and rain. And slowly but surely, the water levels rose. The banks collapsed and the sea encroached. And Brading was flooded. People were dying, and the Tréowmann watched. And he stood up from his point on the hill and made his way down. And as he did, he saw the one last oak that they had not felled. He ripped it from the ground, roots and all, and pushed it in to save the people of the town. He took people to safety, and then, as the storm subsided and the waters subsided, they cheered him on. But for the first time, the Tréowmann actually felt remorse. He felt emotion, and he felt remorse for pulling out that tree, his family. And so, as the townspeople celebrated, he wandered off. And as he did, he pulled off pieces of himself and planted them all along Brading Down, so that they would one day grow into a great woodland once again. Till finally all that was left was part of his torso, one arm and his head. And he dragged himself to a place that is now known as Nunwell. And in this place there was a holy well, where he lay down and let his body decay into the earth, where to this day is still what is called the Great Oaken Grove. No oaks grow there anymore. They're long gone, but it's said that if you listen around where the holy well once was in the Great Oaken Grove, you can still hear the rustling and the groans of the Tréowmann. And now on to our next story, the Giant of Chael. This is the legend of Black Gang Chine, written by Abraham Elder. Now, who's Abraham Elder? This is almost as much of a mystery as the stories that he told. Abraham Elder wrote a book called The Tales and Legends of the Isle of Wight, Part 1. And he wrote this Victorian book, which catalogued and captured many of the folk tales of the island, or some. The fact that it was called Part 1 tells us that there was probably another part coming at some stage, but it never did. Now, there is no records of Abraham Elder. The records that I have been able to find from his publishing house has no records of Abraham Elder. The people that's spoken about in the book, there's a Mr. Winterblossom. They mention of Mr. Winterblossom. So this is one of the great mysteries for me, is who is this storyteller? I guess we'll never know. So let me tell you the story in Abraham Elder's own words of the Giant of Chael. The dwellers of Wight, they once did wail when they lived in dread of the Giant of Chael. The Giant of Chael was mighty and big, and he loved men's flesh better than pig. He chose those that were tall and heavy, and stewed the fat ones in their own gravy. The children he tried with bonds of wire, and broiled them alive on a charcoal fire. He dyed his hands with man's blood red. He laughed and shook his sides and said, I care not for a saint in his lonely cell. I care not for book, and I care not for hell. I care not for heaven, and I care not for hell. I live upon man's flesh, and fat me well. The saint was praying on his knees for those that are dead and those that be. And as he raised his voice in prayer, he heard the curses fly through the air. The holy man was struck with dread, and every hair stood upon his head, for he knew the time was a fated hour when the spirits of earth and sea have power. And that which is holy quakes and quails, for the time of the spirit of sin prevails. The fiendish laughter thrilled through his bones, and he answered the sound of mirth with groans. He hailed the voice as it came on the wind. Why is thy title? What is thy kind? What is it that scoffs to a saint and cell? Who cares not for book and cares not for bell? Who cares not for heaven and cares not for hell, but lives upon man's flesh and fates him well? The burly giant rose from his lair when he heard the questions ring through the air, and he poured a goblet filled with blood, and he dipped his hands in the gory flood. He made a sign with his bloody hand and drew the figure in the sand. I'll make his spirit quake and quail, that questioneth the ogre of Chale. I dare him to meet me at midnight dread, when the horned moon is overhead. For then the lower spirits and upper, and those of the earth, I've asked to supper. Then the imps that ride on desolate wind shall chant him in thunder, my title and king. There was heard, when the blood of the sign had dried, a whizzing sound on every side. It sang in Culver's goblin cave. It sang in the needles over the wave. It sang on Helka's frozen strand. It sang on the desert's burning sand. It sang in the mountains and the clouds above. And the whizzing sound went up to the moon, and the sound went down to the ocean's depths. And the Kelpies were roused from their evening sleep. And though the night was clear and still, the wind seemed to whistle round Catherine's hill. The sound came not in the chapel fair, because a sign of the cross was there. The bloody sign was the sign of might to every being that shuns the light, whether made by sprite or child of clay. The bloody signal they must obey. The holy man was struck with fear when the words of the giant rang in his ear. For the giant was mighty in wizard power, and Halloween was a dreadful hour. But the fearfullest time was the midnight dread, when the horned moon was overhead. The saint had been dared to come that night or acknowledge his fear of the giant sprite. He took him a staff of mountain ash, his pilgrimage script and calabash. Nor spirit did he hold in scorn, distilled from the barley corn, for he had grown infirm and old to keep himself from catching cold. Excuse me. To keep himself from catching cold. At midnight he left his lonely cell to seek the giant's flowery dell. In the lovely vale, all down by sea, was a cave of the giant's cruelty. The valley's side was blooming fair, for every flower blossomed there. The violet and primrose gay, and cowslip tall adorned the way, nodded to him and bluebell hair, and smiled a yellowish daffodil there. The heath its little eye did twinkle, and started the humble periwinkle. Snapdragon opened its yellow mouth, sunflower turned its face from south. The blown red rose smiled in matron pride at the little rosebuds around her side, besprinkled with dewdrops all round, like a diamond necklace down to the ground. Foxglove showed its sunburnt face, and bent and bowed its vulgar grace. Fluttered a leaf to the moonbeam wan, just as a lady flutters her fan. And every daisy on the hill, with its yellow face and ocean white frill, seemed each to giggle and shake its head, as though it could, it would have said, "'Twas a comical time and a comical place to look at the Giant of Chael in the face. But though the bank was blooming fair, and the robin redbreast dwelt not there, for the robin was a friend of man, and would not eat from the ogre's hand, though all things seemed to laugh and jeer. They could not put the saint in fear, for he had dared both death and chain, and a noble spirit ran in his vein. Suddenly there crashed a clap of thunder, which filled the saint with awe and wonder, and just before his pathway a cave yawned in the mountain clay. The cavern it was not paved with stone, but strewn around with dead men's bones. On a throne of skulls of giants the giant sat, and his laps were fed with dead man's fat. The sea was studded with goblin sails, and snakes and adders danced on their tails. The bats fly high and the bats flow low. The owlets hoot and the ravens crow. The dragons, they rattle their scaly wings. The scorpions show their poison stings. For the spirits appeared in every shape. One took the form of a long-legged ape, and one was like a large black cat, and one was like a boar, and one like a rat. One grinned in the form of a dusky bear, another like a spotted hare, another like a bloated toad that spat his venom on the road. They laughed and they grinned and they jeered to see the saint come to join their revelry. The owlet he hooted, his laugh in the air, and in the laughter growled the dusky bear. 'Twas a horrible thing to hear and see these beasts, how they mimicked humanity. On the table, in lieu of a loaf of bread, was the bodiless but living head. This sightless eyeballs it rolled about, and its bloodless tongue it lolled out. The giant has called for his favorite dish of reptiles alive and loathsome fish. The cup it was brought in an earthenware pails. The mermen who carried them hopped on their tails. The leeches crept in and the leeches crept out. The blind worms and lizard wiggled about. As the demons raised their cups on high, there arose a shout, a yell, a cry. Here's a curse on the living, a curse on the dead. And here's the health to the head. Old man, there is a fire of charcoal peat. Do you wish to be roasted, or will you eat? Here's a boiling lake. You stand on the brink. Do you wish to be stewed down, or will you drink? The saint, he was filled with such dismay, he could not speak and he could not pray. The carrion vulture was over his head, and under his feet were the bones of the dead. A human skeleton round they laid, and one of them turned as if were in pain. But then the sign of the cross he made. His courage came, and he spoke and said, I bless the living, and I best bless the dead. I curse upon thee, and I curse the head. I curse the hill, and I curse the strand. I curse the ground whereupon you stand. Nor flowers nor fruit this earth shall bear, but all shall be dark and waste and bare. Nor shall the ground give footing dry to beasts that walk or birds that fly, but a poisonous stream shall run to the sea, bitter to taste and bloody to see. And the earth, it shall crumble and crumble away, and crumble on till the judgment day. He spoke, and a mist came over his eyes, and he saw not the land, and he saw not the sky. But when the mist had rolled away, the earth looked black, and the rocks looked grey, and at his feet flowed a blood-stained rill, and bleak and lonely stood the hill. And that's the story of the Giant of Chael. And Black Gang Chine did eventually fall into the sea, as did the village. The name Black Gang Chine comes from basically Old English, that basically means a black or dark place, or black or dark road. It's still a very strange and creepy place. Not one where you'd want to go after dark if you can help it. Interestingly, in this story or in this poem, again, we have the analogies that are very much in line with the old Anglo-Saxon idea of giants, and there being imps and being of that kind. You know, there is no distinction, only that he is much bigger than the smaller imps. And I think it's beautiful. But I find it a very grim poem, to be sure. Probably not one for tiny kids. I don't know. I've read it to my children; they quite enjoy it. But as I said, Black Gang Chine did fall into the sea, and there is a blood red stream or brook that runs there. It's very hard to find now, and it only ever runs when it has been raining quite a bit. And they say the water is bitter, though I wouldn't try it these days. But there we go. So there's the Giant of Chael by the venerable Abraham Elder, who, as I said, the mystery surrounding who he is just as interesting as the stories that he wrote. At the end of this, he goes on to say, Abraham Elder, he says, speaking to his friend, Mr. Winterblossom, he says, "Pray, Mr. Winterblossom," said I, "do you consider this legend to be an undoubted antique?" "All I know about it," replied he, "is that the copy of it that was given to me 20 years ago was written upon a very dirty piece of paper, and certainly in an old-fashioned character. There appears to me also to be a certain quaintness about it that smacks of age. But whether it is really old as the time of Walter de Langstrel, the hermit of St. Catherine's, or not, I have not the means to inform you." "Oh," said I, "then there was certainly a hermit at St. Catherine." "Most undoubtedly," This Walter de Langshaw appears to have lived in the reign of Edward II, but whether he got drunk on whiskey and decided that he went to court at the devil's leave, at this distance of time, it is impossible to ascertain. It is very probable a mere monkish tale. So, that's the story, and the rest of this book. And if you're interested in any of this sort of thing, I suggest you go and find it. You can get it for free. It's well out of copyright now, so if you go to archive.org, you can read it there, or Google Books as well. It's well worth a read, but keep in mind that it is of its time and written very much in the Victorian manner. Not as bad as some, but still it is within its time. And so we're going to move on to Geat, the story of Geat the Builder. Geat, or Gautr. Gautr being the old Anglo-Saxon, Geat being the more modern interpretation of his name. So it's said that Geat was the son of Gogmagog. Gogmagog was the last great giant who was thrown into the sea after wrestling with Corineus. It's said that Corineus defeated Gogmagog by throwing him either off the cliffs at Dover or Plymouth or somewhere in Cornwall, and some even say in Wales, but always thrown into the sea. And that's normally where the story ends, but not here on the island. They say that Gogmagog floated in the sea, having many months to think on his sins and the war that he had against humanity. And although the floating in the sea didn't change his heart, it softened it a little bit as his body weakened and his wounds started to turn septic. Eventually, the winds and the tides brought him to the Isle of Wight, to the south of the island. And there he was washed ashore and found by a poor woman who lived with her father. The poor woman tended to his wounds and cared for him, and with the help of her father were able to drag him onto the sand and then close to the house, where they fed him and brought back his strength somewhat. And Gogmagog found his heart softening and took her as his wife, even though he knew he was not much long for this world. And every day that passed, he became weaker and weaker. And soon after their marriage, he died, but not before leaving her pregnant. Now, when giants lay with humans, the offspring, no one knows, and are unpredictable. Sometimes the baby will take 9 months, just like a human baby. Sometimes 3 months, sometimes 3 years. It's just unpredictable. But in this case, the baby grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. And after 4 or 5 months, the strain on the poor woman's body was too much. Her old father took her down to a place where a healer was. And this place is now called, sorry, excuse me for a second. Excuse me. Excuse me. Her father took her down to a place which is now called Puckcaster. But back then, it was called Ilfhum, or the Yelf home, the place of the elves, and the Puck are the elves. Maybe that's how the name came about. And that's where she lived. And she gave the poor woman, the poor girl, many herbs to send her to sleep. And as she did, she cut the babe out of her, sewed up the poor woman, and gave her what gruel she had to help her get her strength back. Unfortunately, the poor woman couldn't survive the injuries from carrying the child of a giant. And in her last breath, she named her baby Geat. Geat was brought up by his grandfather. He taught him how to work honestly and taught him the wrongs of his father and of his kind. Geat was large and tall even from an early age, but he wasn't gigantic as the old giants were, but he was a big, strong boy. It's said that he was able to pick his grandfather up at age of 5 and sat him on his head. And he would walk his grandfather from town to town as they picked up tinker jobs. And everyone would see Geat sitting on his grandfather sitting on Geat's head, and everyone knew who he was. As his grandfather grew older, Geat set out on his own. And Geat ended up walking around the island and doing good deeds. He was known for being the most helpful of men. And all he ever asked for was a pint of ale and a chunk of bread and a bit of cheese as reward. Eventually, his grandfather too passed away and Geat was left on his own. So Geat finally walked into the center of the island. And as he did, he met builders of great earthworks. And he sat on the side of a hill and watched them. Eventually, one of the men came up to him and implored him to help. Geat was happy to do so. And so they asked him to hew solid rock. And he picked up a great stump and bashed at the stones, and they crumbled with each hit. And he picked them up and placed them on his back as a man would a sack and walk up the hill with them. Day in and day out, he did this. And each evening, his reward was a few pints of ale, some cheese and bread. But Geat was happy. And eventually, he ended up helping build what's a long barrow, which is now called the Longstone, or the Speaking Stones, or what became Motterston or the Motterston. Now, the story goes that Geat was held in such high esteem that even the kings of the island would come and pay their gratitude to him. But everyone knew that Geat would never raise his hands in anger because he was always taught by his father the sins, as by his grandfather. He was taught by his grandfather about the sins of his father. So they never asked him to. One day, there was an invasion of the island. They say that the French came with a sneak attack, sailing up one of the harbors and burnt every town as they came. The warriors of the island, the armies of the island, were completely overwhelmed. And eventually they came and asked and begged Geat for his help. Geat, now an old man, seeing his home burning before his eyes, agreed. But he said he wouldn't take a life. And they said, that's fine. We just want to show them that we have a giant, and maybe they'll turn and run. So Geat came with the nobleman and stood before the French. So terrified were the French that they turned their guns on Geat and fired. Arrows and bolts rained down on Geat. And unfortunately, the giant blood flowed through his veins and he lost control. Geat stood up in a blind rage, went straight into the harbor, toppling over the boat and drowning all the men, picking up the oarsmen and throwing them, picking up the lumps of wood and crushing their skulls. Eventually, what was left of the men were nothing but crushed bone. The harbor ran red with blood. The ship was nowhere to be seen. Not a splinter was left. Geat dragged himself out of the water and sat on the side. He looked at the carnage that he had wrought and turned his back and walked away. As he did, the guilt ate at him inside, for even though he was defending his home, he still could not get away from the oath that he'd broken. So he wandered to the place that he was born. He walked by the sea and found a spot. He lifted the earth, which was covered in grass, took what foliage he could find and fashioned himself a bed. He then pulled the earth over himself and as a covering and went to sleep. This place is now called Binel Point, and it's from the Old English, the place or bed within the hill. And Geat, he sleeps, but will never raise again, for fear of raising his hand against the men that he swore to protect. And that's the story of Geat the Builder. Last story for the evening. This one's a much quicker story, and we'll, as you can see, it's getting close to 8:30. So this is the legend of Orri and the Rock of Everyone knows about the needles on the Isle of Wight, but some don't know that there was one needle that is now disappeared. Sometimes it was called called Lot's wife or the pinnacle, but the people of magic know it as the rock or the pinnacle of Once upon a time, there were a clan of giants called Orri, and they were great workers of magic. They built many things through the country, and they infused them with much magic. But like many of their kind, they sided with Gog Magog in his war against humanity. And then when Gog Magog was defeated, those few clans that were left were cursed. And the clan Orri were cursed in such a way that they were no longer able to have children. Over the years, the remaining members of the clan dispersed and died of old age and other through misadventure. The clan did their best to ensure that the charms of making and magic were passed on, but as there were no new generations left, the situation became quite desperate. It's said that the last four of the clan met in some central point in Britain. And they met and they made a plan. One went north and met with the Picts, and he helped them build magical works based on fire, because that was in their blood. One went west and helped the people build Stonehenge and other great works based on the earth, because that was in their blood. A third went to the east, and he helped them build such great monuments to the spirits and to the dead, for their magic was based on air, and that was in their blood. And last, the smallest of the Orri. But some say he was the most skilled. He went south, and he came to the island, and he found that the magic was based on water, deep and unfathomable, never to be contained or held. This Orri followed the dragon's spine until he came to her tail, where he stopped and thought, this is fine. This is where I will build. He took his time. Many weeks it took him to build, because he built from the very froth of the sea. He took the sea itself and built the great pinnacle of Ur. He imbued it with all his magic, every bit. He weaved the charms of making and creation around it until he had but a little left. And he sat down on the high downs and looked over his work. And then he heard a sound, a shrill little sound in the distance, a whistle. And he turned and he saw a young man coming by. The young man looked up at the giant. He wasn't fearful. He had courage in his heart. And he spoke to the giant and he said, "You look tired." "I am," said Orri. "You look hungry." "I am," Orri was able to say. And the young man walked off and whistled as he walked off. Within the hour, he came back holding a horse and with a cart dragged behind it. Whistling as he came, he looked up at the giant and he said, "This is all I could get." And in the cart, there were bags of flour. There were barrels of mead, dried meats and cheese and bread. Orri looked down, and although the rations were tiny by his standards, he took them and he devoured them in one tiny gulp. The care and hospitality that this man had shown had touched the giant. He thanked the man with all that he could. He lay down on the ground and fell to sleep. When Orri woke, The young man was still there, smiling. Still exhausted, the Orri turned and whispered to the man and said, I give you one last gift that I have to give. And whispered gently. Orri told the man the stories of his clan. He told him how once they used to be numerous, but now they were few and soon to be none. He explained the importance of the rock he had created, and he taught the man the final magics with his last breath. For with every word, we build a spell. And he taught those last words to the man. And as Orri breathed his last words, he asked the man to look after the rock. And the man agreed and promised. And so it was, this was the first archmagus or druid of the island. They say that this line of succession was true until the day the rock finally fell. When the rock fell, the sound was so great that the wells on the island collapsed. It was like a great wailing cried out upon the island, Orri's own spirit crying in pain. And it was said on that day that the last of the archmagus died, and with him, the secret of the Orri magic words. And all we have to remember them is a stump of the rock of Ur. And that, my friends, thank you so much for sticking with me, is the end of our storytelling tonight. So I'm now happy to open things up to any questions. If anyone has anything or comments, just take yourself off mute and have at it. If you've got anything to ask or say.
Hi, everybody. How's it going? My name's Jason.
Hi, Jason. I'm not too bad, apart from my little cough.
Yeah, you sound a little bit under the weather, but well done for soldiering through.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, really, where would you go about finding these kind of tales and like kind of almost like secret history of the island in a way? Like I've only been here for just coming up to a year. I moved here last year, but I'm very much fascinated by old storytelling and kind of folklore. So how would I go about getting my teeth into more Isle of Wight folklore?
Well, as I said earlier, seek out the Tales and Legends of the Isle of Wight by Abraham Elder.
Okay.
It's a great read. There's another book that you might, again, from the Victorian period, which is called The Legends and Lays of the Isle of Wight.
Legends of Lays of the Isle of Wight.
The Legends and Lays of the Isle of Wight. Yep.
Like ley lines, L-E-Y?
L-A-Y.
L-A-Y.
Yeah, different meaning. But they kind of related. Basically, a lay is an old way of saying, a yarn or a tall tale.
Yeah.
By, I can't remember the guy's name, but they're free. They're well out of copyright now. You can just go onto archive.org and get them and have a read. There's various other books out there. You can check out my website. Every so often I post stories and things there. And you can keep coming to these because I'm doing them every month. So
cool. Yeah, I saw a little ad on Instagram, or I don't know if that was an ad or recommended or whatever. And I love a bit of giants. I really do. I love tales about giants. So I was like, I wasn't going to miss this.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the stories.
Yeah, I did. I very much did. And because I haven't been on the island so long, it's fun to go exploring. I mean, I'm friends with someone who's quite a neo-pagan, so to speak, and she takes me to different parts of the island. So it'll be nice to have a little bit of artillery in my pocket next time we go on one of those walks. So much obliged.
Wonderful, my pleasure. Thank you for joining me.
Pleasure. Right, I'm going to mute now in case anyone else wants to jump in.
Okay. Anyone else? Don't be shy. I don't bite.
Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Faiza.
Hi, Faiza. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. With me is my daughter listening to your stories, and it's very, very interesting. I had never thought of Isle of Wight from that point of view, and read a lot of history of it, but myths and folklores is something that is very new to me, especially of the Britain and particularly of Isle of Wight. It was very, very informative and very interesting. Other thing that was very interesting was that how wherever you go, how we modify the things, or we make these stories are present in all parts of the world, but how wherever you go, it's locally modified according to geography of that area, according to the habitat of the people there, and the things that are important to them.
Absolutely. I think it's important to remember that folklore is part of our combined commonwealth. It's owned by all of us, and it's a living, breathing thing.
Yeah.
It stagnates when people forget that. And whenever I hear someone say, "Oh, that's not the story. This is the story." No.
But these individual features then beautify it.
Yeah, exactly.
And makes a local legend of it.
Exactly. And I think that's really important. And you're right, these stories are shared and shared experiences.
It's kind of shared heritage of the humanity.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's
and
like you said, the giants were then everywhere. You read that the giants were thrown into the sea.
Yeah.
Whereas coming from north of Pakistan, there is no concept of sea there. But a similar giant, but in a very different geographical location. So that was very, very interesting thing. Thank you so much for sharing.
My pleasure. And did your daughter enjoy them?
Presented it very well, very beautifully.
Oh, thank you.
We have both enjoyed it very well.
Well, I hope you'll join our next one in June.
Yes, sure. Yes, sure. We are already looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining
me.
Bye-bye.
Bye for the time.
Anyone else have any questions or comments or criticisms? If just be gentle.
I thought it was really well done, and thank you for the talk. And there's a lot. I don't know if you've seen in the chat, but a lot of people have made comments in the chat.
No, I haven't actually looked at the chat. I should look at that, shouldn't I? Here we go. Oh, wow. You're right. There are. Oh, fantastic. Sorry, everyone, for not responding to the chats. Let's see what we got here. We can hear you now. I've used the advanced share. See, thank you. Really enjoyed this, but unfortunately have to go. That's okay. Well, you're already gone, so there's no point in saying that. Thank you much. I was wondering how this humane representation of giants shows something. I have found similar storytelling attributes in other community stories, not in Britain, and it probably means something to show some respect to the giants as creatures. Yeah, I think, and that was Irene said that. Thank you so much, Irene. Sorry for stopping on you there, Amber. Did you have anything else that you want to say? No. Yeah, it's the modern, even ancient interpretations of giants have always been at odds with humanity, and as you saw from those stories, it's a mixed bag. Not all giants are good, not all giants are bad. I think there is an interesting tragic tale. No matter whether the giant is good or bad, there is still this tragicness about them, because whether they are whether they're aggressive towards humanity or not, there's still this ending that is always going to be there. And that's one of the things that struck me about all the stories about giants, is there is a tragicness about them. It's a beauty in that tragedy. I wonder if that says, what that says about humanity as much as the giants. So great question, Irene. I hope you're still here and heard my response there. What else have we got here? Thank you for this talk. You're more than welcome, Amber. That was for you. Interesting and soothing, not the bloody bits. My son would disagree with you there. That's his favorite bits.
I like those bits. I just meant that they weren't so soothing.
That's true. That is true. Warm and.
Do you think, sorry, Paul,
Sorry,
do you think the end, how these folklores end by making these giants a victim, or a soft victim? Is it to show that the human, a short-sized human, eventually conquer or came empowered the giant, the previous generation of humans?
Yeah,
Is it just to soothe us?
Quite possibly. I mean, a lot of the tales. I mean, if you look at the biblical tales,
because we tell these stories to our kids when they are actually, these stories, how they were passed on. These stories used to be told to kids at bedtime about the giants, and then you don't want to give them a horrific detailed ending, so you tell them that how they eventually subdued or they withdrew.
Yeah, but I also think it's about humanity as well, overcoming obstacles, and in some cases, giants are seen as monsters, and humanity overcoming that. You look at the biblical tales, and you look at the Nephilim and things like that. They are almost a punishment. So, and these stories themselves, as I said, one giant is all about eating humans. Another is, was created but turned rotten. One was complete in servitude to humanity and sacrificed himself. And the last had taken on a curse that had come from his own family. So folklore can be allegorical, but there are also folkloric tales that just have no allegory. They're just telling a great story, and it's just about humanity overcoming obstacles.
Yes.
Great question.
Thank you so much.
Anyone else have anything else? Irene has said there are some stories where the giants are not killed at the end, they become allies or something like this. Yeah, I need to reflect about the tragic element you mentioned. Great point. So many questions for me to study and search for. Thank you again. You are right. Yep, some giant stories, they become allies. Yeah, and again, but is that humanity overcoming insurmountable, giants, taming them to their own will? Who knows? And Shashta, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. Thank you. I lost audio after hearing Lay Tall Tales. I conformed to Zoom. My first Zoom meeting, the first Druid, but how did it become? Right. Sorry. My glasses are really mucky. That's why I'm sort of mumbling here. So I don't think that the person became the first Druid in so much as became the first Druid of the island, or the first, what was called the Archdruid. So there is the story, and again, this is in Abraham Elder's works, and there's a few other tales about this, of the Archdruid, and sometimes referred to as the Archmagus, who's seen as the embodiment of all that is magical on the island. The high priest, I guess, in all magical ways. And that's kind of where it came from. No problem. Warmund, is that how you pronounce your name? Sorry if I'm mangling it. I'm really sorry about that. Anyone else have any questions? Please feel free to ask. No one else? Wendy, Irene, Jane, do you have anything? These are just names that are popping up. So just all right. Well, if no one has anything more to ask, thank you so much for joining me. Next month, it's a bit of a flip between talking about Anglo-Saxon or the Utish gods and goddesses or dragons. So we'll see how we go. It's going to be one of those two. Thank you so much. If you guys have any questions, feel free to contact me on whatever system you found out about this from. Just send me a message and I'll do my best to answer questions. Thank you so much. I appreciate you all coming. It means so much to me. It's been amazing. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.